Okay? God chooses them, and those who are chosen respond in the right way. Because the wrong way was to pursue righteousness on your own. The right way was to pursue righteousness by grace. To just call on the name of the Lord and you'll be saved. So those who get righteousness are those who pursue it by grace. Follow me? And those who are elect are those who pursue it the right way. In other words, God chooses people and they choose back. That's what Paul's point there is. But let's keep going. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see and ears that could not hear, to this very day. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion be? And now Paul shifts. He's going to use a metaphor of a tree and branches grafted in to try to illustrate a very important point. You and I are mostly Gentiles in this room. Can we look smugly at the Jewish people who reject God? Do we have the right to do that? To say, hey, we believe we're better than you? Or to look at anybody who doesn't believe and say, we believe we're better than you? Do we have that right? Check this out. Paul says, I'm talking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles. I take pride in my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what would their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to the other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith, not by your own works, by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He will not spare you either. In other words, if God's willing to cut them off because they don't believe, why do you think God would ever keep you if you lose your belief? Okay, that's a little scary, but let's see what he's saying here. After all, if you were cut, let's 22, excuse me. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in His kindness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So, don't be arrogant, because God picks who gets grafted in. It's up to Him, not because you're somehow more special than anyone else. If you believe and someone else doesn't, that doesn't make you better. Let's go more. Verse 25, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As far as the gospel is concerned, they're enemies for your sake, but as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. God chose the patriarchs a long time ago. God still loves those He chooses. For God's gift and His call are irrevocable. Just as you who were at one time disobedient to God have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience, so they too have now become disobedient in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. For God has bound everyone over to disobedience so that He may have mercy on them all. Okay, we've been through this long journey so far through these chapters. And it boils down to this. God chooses in his own grace whom he will save. And those he chooses respond for grace, not on their own works. They respond in faith for God's grace. That's the way this thing works. And then Paul says this little phrase here at the end, will all Israel be saved? Well, I just got to say this. The whole point of this branch and olive tree metaphor is basically there's no category, not Israel, not the Gentiles. There's no category that's guaranteed. Just because you were born Methodist doesn't mean you're guaranteed. Just because you were born Jewish doesn't mean you're guaranteed. Just because you were born anything doesn't mean you're guaranteed. So when Paul says all Israel will be saved, he's talking about the real Israel, the Israel God calls, the Israel God chooses, the Israel who the heirs of the original Abraham who demonstrated by faith. That's what he's talking about. He calls us, and we are the true Israel. We are the ones who are being saved. Now, he's definitely saying that God still loves the people of Israel, but after all, he loves everybody. He sent Jesus for everybody, and he puts grace out there for everybody. So, I got to try to bring this back down. It's already 10:15. I got to try to bring this back down to earth. And we got two things to accomplish to remain. Number one is to put our attention back on God, and less on ourselves, less on our internal debates, whether it's fair or whatever this stuff is. So we turn to 33. Paul ends this way. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments, and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God so that God would repay them? For from him, and through him, and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Paul says, listen, I don't know all the answers, but I know this. God is way above us. And his plan and his path are so far above us. So what does it mean for us? How do you possibly know if God has chosen you? Well, there are a couple hints here in this passage. There are two, in fact, that I want to draw your attention to. How do you know you're saved? How do you know God has chosen you? How do you know you're part of the category of people that God has picked in his own grace? How do you know that? Here you go. Number one, make your election sure. Ensure your election by submitting to God's way of grace. The key word there is submitting to God's way of grace. If you are trying to earn your salvation, if you are trying to do the right things to try to prove to God that you are good enough, you don't fall under the category of those who are elect. You fall under the category of the Israelites who are trying to do it on their own strength. Those who are elect are those who respond properly, and responding properly is calling on God and saying, God, I need you far more than I need me. Submitting to God's way of grace. If you do that, the Bible promises that you are part of the elect. You are part of the chosen. You are part of the group of people that God is going to save for all eternity. Because these are the people who are the elect. Next, ensure your election by humbly sharing this gospel with others. Humbly spreading this gospel. Listen, how will they hear unless someone tells them? You might say, this isn't fair. What about those people who never hear the message of Jesus? I'm going to tell you straight up, it's not God's fault, it's yours. And it's mine. If there's a person out there who hasn't heard the message of Jesus, it's because there's a human being who hasn't told them. It's not our job to choose them. It's not our job to get them saved, but it's our job to be part of calling them. So ensure your election by being part of the process of sharing the message, not part of the process of just blaming God that he's doing this in a way that doesn't seem fair to you. Because God is just. And he's choosing them, and sometimes he's choosing them with your mouth.